Here we go for second semester final exam review for macro. You can pause this video at any time and read over the material that's on there, so I'll just try to supplement what's on the page. So here's the first unit. We covered a lot of things about macro indicators and how do we know how the economy is doing and how do we know when things are going wrong. So macroeconomics is the study of the economy as a whole, or the entire economy. And you'll notice at the bottom of the slides are these kind of next questions to state, what's going to be on the next slide. So feel free to pause when I say the word next to move on, to see if you can guess what's on the next slide. The three major economic indicators in macro are GDP, which measures production. We want growth to be around 3%. We want low unemployment. So unemployment was another factor. And then inflation, we want stable prices. So next. GDP is expressed in dollars, so it's the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country. So used goods don't count as gross domestic product. Stocks and bonds don't count because they're not produced. There's nominal GDP and real GDP, which real GDP takes into account inflation. And things like intermediate goods are not final, so they don't count, and we never count things twice. So next. Very simply, GDP is the measure of all consumption, investment, which means business, government, and foreign spending. Next. The four major types of unemployment are frictional, those with who have skills and no jobs. Structural unemployment, usually those that are replaced by technology or low-level skilled employees. Seasonal unemployment, and then cyclical, which would be when there's a downturn in the economy, people get laid off. Next. The natural rate of the full employment is somewhere around 5% today. Next. Inflation is a rise in the general price level. So not all goods are getting more expensive. Just in general, it's taking more money to have the same standard of living. Next. There are three types of inflation. We focus most often at the CP level about demand pull inflation and cost push. So either there's so much demand for products that it pulls the price level up, or that costs of production are rising and those are pushing inflation upwards and causing problems. There's also the quantity theory, but at CP we don't have to worry about that type of inflation. So next. Basically, inflation can hurt and help various groups. So inflation hurts people on fixed income. It hurts lenders like banks. It helps borrowers, and it helps producers, inflation. Next. Business cycle shows the rise and fall of economic activity, and a recession is defined as 2 or more consecutive quarters in GDP. Next. So expansion is a period of growth where unemployment is falling as people gain jobs, and a peak is a point where there is too much expansion and it begins to bring high inflation. Next. Then a contraction is when we've reached a peak and the economy starts to decline. We notice that people start getting laid off, that producers are not making as much profit or generating enough revenue. And then eventually we hit a trough, which is the lowest point of the business cycle when real GDP stops falling and we start to notice we're back into an expansion phase after that. So basically the natural rates are things like GDP should be growing at about 3%. Inflation should be somewhere between 1% and 3%, and then unemployment should be around 5%. Any variation from those ranges typically means that there's a problem in the economy. Here's our overview slide of Unit 7, kind of dealing with the aggregate demand and supply model, and then fiscal policy. So you'll definitely need to know how to graph the AS/AD model and how to manipulate it, show the changes in AS and AD in the short run. So next. Aggregate demand is the total amount of spending in the economy, and so it measures the amount of spending. More spending, more aggregate demand. Less spending, less aggregate demand. Next. Aggregate demand is basically the total quantity of goods and services demanded at a given price level, and it is downward sloping like all the other demand curves we've drawn this year. Next. So in blue you can see the aggregate demand curve sloping downwards, and then a version of the aggregate supply curve. The shift factors for aggregate demand are if consumers spend more or less, investment, meaning businesses spend more or less, government spends more or less, or foreigners spend more or less. So exports and imports have an effect on aggregate demand. Next. So things like tax cuts could shift aggregate demand because tax cuts mean more income means more spending. If consumers are optimistic about the future, they're going to spend more. If there's a decrease in interest rates, people will spend more. Increase in government spending, however that looks, is going to mean more AD. Next. And then the vice versa of all of those would decrease aggregate demand. Pessimism about the future, interest rates go up, government spends less, taxes increase. Next. So aggregate supply is basically the production at each price level of the economy and how much producers are willing and able to produce at given price levels. Next. Now the Keynesian model views it as three separate ranges, and basically they look at a recession phase of the economy, an expansionary phase of the economy, and then a peak in the economy. And that horizontal range, price levels not raising much, and so the economy is in a recession as low levels of output mean generally low price levels. Then as the economy begins to expand, it reaches the expansion phase, and that increase in production comes with it, increase in price levels. And then finally in the vertical range, eventually production hits a standstill as any additional production or consumption really just leads to more inflation. Next. So we notice here are different ranges. So we have here's AD in a recession, starting to get out of a recession. Now we've entered into an expansion, and then eventually an AD over here would mean that the economy is currently in a peak. So now we kind of transfer that to say well, if we're in a recession or in a peak, what can government do? And that's where we turn to fiscal policy. Next. Fiscal policy is the government interacting in the macroeconomy. By either changing taxation or spending levels, it can influence and stimulate or slow down aggregate demand. And so Congress and the President typically decide fiscal policy actions. Next. The tools of fiscal policy are simply taxes and government spending. Next. So during a recession, the government would likely initiate expansionary fiscal policy, which would mean lowering taxes and raising government spending. Next. And by decreasing taxes and increasing government spending, that will initiate an increase in aggregate demand, putting people back to work. Next. Here's a beautifully drawn graph of the AS and AD curve showing us in a recession. And then because of expansionary fiscal policy, aggregate demand rising, bringing us back into expansion. So contractionary policy, here's some questions to look over, and then pause it and see if you guessed right. So again, we want to slow down the economy, bring down inflation, so the goal is to decrease aggregate demand. Next. So the government would work on raising taxes and or lowering government spending to bring aggregate demand back down. And shown by this beautiful graph of aggregate demand showing a peak, high inflation, and then getting back to our expansion. So contractionary fiscal policy decreases aggregate demand. And then this was a backlash. Keynesian economics and aggregate demand and fiscal policy was a reaction to the classical economists, which basically believed that markets should not be messed with, that the government should not play a role in the economy because markets will self-correct or correct itself. So classical economists use the phrase laissez-faire approach, which means hands-off, meaning the government should not play a role, should not manipulate the economy. Next. So in budgeting, in fiscal budgeting, we can either have a surplus, a deficit, or a balanced budget. So a deficit means the government spends more than they receive in taxes, a surplus is the opposite, and debt is the accumulation of all of the previous deficits. Then we got into money, banking, and the monetary policy agents. First question. And so money must act as a medium of exchange, meaning it's acceptable. It must act as a unit of account, meaning that it's easy to measure the price tag of something. I like to think of the unit of account as being, if you know it's a ripoff, then it has a good unit of account. And then the store of value, money keeps its value and can be stored for later consumption. Next. So there's two types of money. We have commodity and fiat. Basically, commodity is useful as something. So like tobacco could be used as a commodity money, and it has been in the past. Gold is another commodity money. Where our money currently is fiat money, meaning that it's worthless. You really can't do anything with our money other than spend it. Next. So the Fed gets to operate independently of government. They regulate member banks, consist of 12 regions and banks, and 7 board of governors headed by Janet Yellen. Next. Monetary policy is the manipulation of the money supply in order to influence aggregate demand to either get us out of a recession or contract us from a peak and bring down inflation. Next. The Fed's 3 main tools are open market operations, the buying and selling of bonds, changing then the reserve requirement and discount rate. Next. So the Federal Open Market Committee meets every 6 weeks to figure out how to manipulate the money supply based on current and past and potential future market conditions. So in order to increase the money supply, the Fed buys government bonds and lowers all of the rates. And during a peak, when the Fed notices too high inflation, the Fed will decrease the money supply by selling bonds and raising all of the rates. Next. Reserve requirement is the percentage of all deposits you have to keep in reserve, or banks must keep in reserve. And the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement, which tells us how much money can be expanded through the loaning process. Next. So if I deposit $100 into a bank and the reserve requirement is 10%, 10% of that money must go in reserve, so the bank must hold $10 back and then can loan out $90, which is the rest. So with the money multiplier, if we take the deposit of 100 times the multiplier, we get the total change in deposits, which is $1,000. Next. The discount rate is the interest rate the Fed charges banks for loans. Next. So here's expansionary or easy money policy. The Fed would buy bonds, reduce the discount rate, and lower the reserve requirement. Next. During a recession, the Fed works to lower interest rates, which increases the likelihood of spending by businesses and consumers, thus increasing aggregate demand and boosting us out of a recession by putting people back to work. Next. This graph should look familiar because it's the same graph as fiscal policy. The opposite of easy money policy is tight money policy, when the Fed sells bonds and raises the discount rate and reserve requirement to reduce the amount of money in supply, thus bringing down inflation. We get into our last macro unit, international trade, and here are some of the key concepts. So who should trade what? Well, first off, the key is specialization. Each country, each group of people need to specialize and produce only one thing. Much like one day you'll grow up and get a job and you will specialize and do one thing, and you will trade your money for everything else. So you're not going to produce your own food and clothing because it's cheaper for big companies to do that for you and sell it at a much lower price than you could produce it by yourself. Next. So absolute and comparative advantage are different. Absolute advantage just looks at who's better at producing something, whereas comparative looks at and compares the opportunity cost of producing. Next. So as we look at this problem as an output problem, we notice there's 2 people, Priscilla and Johnny, and they're producing 2 items, ham hocks and steakettes. And if we look first at the absolute advantage, who's better at producing ham hocks? So we look here. Well, before we do the math, we're just looking at 6 and 3 and saying, well, Priscilla is better at producing ham hocks. So she holds the absolute advantage. And she's also better at producing steakettes. So in this case, Priscilla has the absolute advantage in both because she can produce more than Johnny. When we look at the opportunity cost is when we do the opposite divided by inside, or as Mr. Barron has put, other goes over. So in this case, we would move for Priscilla to produce ham hocks. She could have produced 4 over 6, which reduces down. And then on the vice versa, in the steakettes box, she could produce 6/4, so it's 1.5. So we look at those opportunity costs for Priscilla and Johnny. We would notice that Johnny should produce ham hocks because he does so at a lower opportunity cost, and Priscilla should produce steakettes because, again, the lower opportunity cost. So there are cons to trade. We usually say that trade is good, but there are some arguments against international trade, and we call those protectionist arguments. Next. So protectionists are groups of people that are against trade for one reason or another. They are probably opposed to outsourcing and importing goods from other countries, and propose laws such as tariffs and quotas to limit foreign goods so that domestic producers consume more domestic products. Next. tariffs are simply a tax on imports, and there are two types. The smaller of the two is called a revenue tariff, which is just meant to make a little bit of money for the government. And then there's a protective tariff, which will greatly reduce foreign business in the country and make it much more likely that domestic consumers will consume domestic products. The exchange rate is defined as the price of one currency in terms of another. So if it costs $2 to get 1 euro, it would then only cost you 0.5 euro to get a dollar. Next. So when converting currencies, you basically have to set up a ratio that's equal. So if $2 gets 1 euro, a hat that would be 40 euros would cost $80. As we multiply the exchange rate out, 40 euros equals how many dollars? Well, the ratio is $2 to 1 euro, so it becomes $80. And you can see the math worked out here. Next. If the price of a euro in dollars goes from $2 to get 1 euro to $1.50 to get 1 euro, this means the dollar is getting stronger or has appreciated. It now takes less dollars to buy 1 euro. So for instance, now that $80 hat we bought before with the new exchange rate only costs Americans $60, which then means Americans are much more likely to buy European goods because we just see the price has gone down by $20 when we exchange currencies. In a weak currency, instead, before the 2 US dollars got 1 euro, now if $4 got 1 euro, the US dollar has gotten weaker or depreciated. So now, with the dollar getting weaker, it now costs more dollars to get that same hat from Europe. So the $80 hat now becomes $160, and we become much less likely to buy from Europe. Next. A trade surplus is very simply when exports are greater than imports. Next. And a trade deficit is simply when exports are less than imports. A trade deficit may be caused by a strong currency or an appreciating currency because foreign goods become less expensive, which means we're going to import more, and that may lead to a trade deficit.